My name is Clara Evans. I am 29 years old and I am a paranormal investigator. Since I was a child, I have had an insatiable curiosity for unexplained mysteries, but my goal has always been to separate reality from imagination. My mission has taken me to frightening places, but nothing prepared me for what I found at the Black Hollow Lighthouse on the coast of Maine. I arrived at the fishing village at dusk. A thick fog covered the place, the salty smell of the sea permeating the air. The lighthouse rose in the distance, a dark tower against the red-gray sky, a solitary monument of brick and rust, battered by time and violent waves. Before heading to the lighthouse, I stopped at a small cafe. The eyes of the few customers followed me to the counter. A gray-haired woman with wrinkled hands approached. "You're not from here, are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse and low. "I came to investigate the lighthouse," I replied, trying to sound confident. The silence that followed was almost physical. The lady leaned in, her eyes fixed on mine. "Some secrets are best left buried, young lady. The lighthouse doesn't like visitors." Before I could respond, she walked away. I paid for my coffee and stepped out into the fog. Her words echoed in my mind, but there was no turning back. I had to find out what really happened to Samuel Briggs, the lighthouse keeper who disappeared in 1923. The trail leading to the lighthouse was treacherous. Wet rocks and slippery moss made every step a challenge. The sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs was deafening. The cold wind bit my face, bringing with it indistinct whispers. When I finally reached the lighthouse, night was already setting in. The structure was larger than I had imagined. Dark bricks covered in mud, broken windows, and a weathered wooden door. Above, the lantern was unlit, but for a moment I swear I saw a dim light flicker. "It must be just a reflex," I muttered, trying to ignore the shivering on the back of my neck. I pushed open the door, which creaked loudly like a groan. The interior smelled of salt, mold, and rust. I took the flashlight from my backpack and shone it into the main hall. Damp walls, old furniture covered in dust, and a spiral iron staircase leading to the top. Each step seemed to invite me to climb. I took a deep breath and began the ascent. Each step echoed in the void. The wind whistled through the cracks, creating sounds that sounded like words. When I reached the first landing, I found what was left of the old barracks: a rusty bed, a broken desk, and on top of it a dusty diary. I opened the diary with trembling hands. The handwriting was firm at first, but it got worse with time. Samuel Briggs spoke of endless nights, of voices coming from the sea and shadows dancing among the waves. "The lighthouse's light is the only thing that keeps the darkness at bay. But something calls to me. The sea, it calls to me." A shiver ran down my spine. I closed the journal and looked around. A noise behind me made me freeze. It was a soft sound, like wet footsteps on the wooden floor. "Is anyone there?" My voice came out weaker than I wanted. No answer, just the rustling of the wind. I climbed the stairs faster. I needed to get to the lantern room. Maybe there was something there that would explain the reports. When I finally reached the top, I pushed open the iron door and stepped inside. The lantern room was small and cold. Broken glass allowed the wind to blow freely. The ancient lens was covered in dust and salt. And then I saw something that made my heart stop. On the floor were wet footprints leading to the edge of the room where the glass was shattered, as if someone had walked there and disappeared. The light from my flashlight failed for a moment. When it came back on, I saw a reflection in the broken glass. A tall, thin figure with soaked clothes and empty eyes. I turned quickly. The room was empty. A whisper filled the air, faint but clear. "Help me." Coldness filled my body. The light from the headlight, which should have been off, shone brightly for a second and then disappeared. I knew something or someone was trapped there. And now it was looking right at me. The whispered "help me" still echoed in my mind. The chill of the lantern room seemed to have seeped into my bones. My heart was pounding and my hands were sweating despite the low temperature. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe the lighthouse with all its decay and history was playing tricks on me. but I knew better. The wet footprints were still there, leading to the shattered glass. The light that had shone for a moment and then disappeared was no illusion. Something was trapped here, something that could not rest. Samuel Briggs, or something worse? I took a deep breath and looked out the broken window. The fog was so thick it seemed like a dense white wall. The sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs echoed like a distant wail. Below, the sharp rocks rose and fell beneath the white foam. "Samuel?" My voice shook. "Are you here?" An oppressive silence answered me. Then a low groan filled the room, like wood creaking under an invisible weight. I turned toward the stairs. The iron door I had left open was now closed. A shiver ran down my spine. I slowly approached the door. I placed my hand on the cold knob and pulled. It didn't budge. It was locked. "No, no, no," I whispered, my voice cracking. I started to knock on the door, but the sound of my fists seemed muffled, as if the room were being swallowed by something invisible. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low, almost a whisper. I turned abruptly. In the middle of the room, where there had been nothing before, stood the figure of a man. His clothes were those of an old lighthouse keeper, soaked and stuck to his thin body. His pale face had empty eyes, and drops of salt water ran down his cheeks, like tears frozen in time. "Samuel Briggs," I whispered. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to understand me. His cracked lips moved. The light must go on. His voice was hoarse and distant, as if coming from the depths of the sea. "It protects us. If the light goes out, he'll come." "Who?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Before he could answer, a deafening crash shook the tower. The room shook and broken glass tinkled. The air grew even colder. Samuel looked up, his empty eyes widening in terror. "He's here." Suddenly, the fog outside stirred violently. A dark shape, gigantic and shapeless, began to materialize between the cliffs. It was as if the darkness itself was coming to life. The shape stretched out, long, undulating arms emerging from the mist, tentacle-like fingers twisting in the void. A deep roar made the ground vibrate. The air grew heavy, and a sense of utter dread washed over me. Samuel looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Turn on the light." I ran to the flashlight's control panel. The switches were covered in dust and rust. My trembling fingers searched for something that might work. Another crash shook the headlight. One of the dark tentacles reached through the broken window, scraping the floor and leaving a scorch mark. My eyes found a rusty lever. I pulled with all my might. It resisted for a second, then gave way with a groan. The flashlight at the top began to slowly rotate. A beam of bright light cut through the mist, illuminating the darkness like a sword. The shadowy figure outside roared in pain. The tentacles writhed, trying to escape the light. Samuel looked at me one last time. A faint, sad smile played across his lips. "Thank you." His figure began to dissolve, turning into droplets of salt water that evaporated into the cold air. The lighthouse's light shone even brighter. The monstrous shadow shrank, twisting and disappearing into the mist, until all that was left was the sound of the waves and the silence. The iron door creaked open of its own accord. I left the lantern room, my legs shaking. I walked slowly down the stairs, each step echoing in the emptiness. When I reached the lobby, the air felt lighter. The oppressive weight had lifted. I opened the lighthouse door and took a deep breath of the salty night air. The sky was clearer now, and the mist was beginning to dissipate. I looked back at the lonely tower. The light continued to spin, strong and steady. Samuel Briggs was free, and the lighthouse, for now, was at peace. My name is Jake Turner. I'm 35 years old, a mystery content producer, and despite the strange places I've visited, I've never encountered anything other than poorly told stories and coincidences. My mission is to expose the truth, separating facts from urban legends. Today, I'm heading to Oregon's Pine Ridge Forest to investigate a story of child disappearances that has been circulating for decades. The trailhead was a narrow opening between twisted trees, almost like a mouth waiting to swallow me. The air was damp and cool, and the late afternoon light filtered through the leaves like golden needles. I turned on my camera and adjusted the microphone. This is Jake Turner, coming from Pine Ridge Forest. I'm about to explore the place where, since the 1950s, several children have disappeared without a trace. Let's see if we can find a logical explanation for this mystery. My voice echoed softly on the trail. I smiled confidently into the camera. It was just another forest, just another story that would lose its power when exposed to the light of reason. I placed the camera on the mount attached to my chest and walked on. The trail was covered in dry leaves and my footsteps made a muffled sound. The silence around me was so dense that it seemed to be watching me. I looked around. Ancient, dark trees surrounded me like motionless sentinels. The forest was so thick that the sky seemed a tangled gray and green. I walked for a few minutes describing the story to the camera. I told them about the children who had disappeared, always between the ages of 5 and 10. Stories spoke of small footprints that appeared out of nowhere and disappeared on the trail, and of children's laughter heard in the darkness. They're just stories, folks. Probably cases of children who got lost, and imagination did the rest. At that moment, my feet stopped by themselves. There was a small footprint on the ground, clearly imprinted in the damp earth. It was fresh, as if someone had passed by there a few minutes ago. A cold draft blew along the trail, and the silence seemed to intensify. The skin on the back of my neck tingled. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the shiver. Someone must have brought a child for a walk here recently. Nothing major. But something didn't add up. There were no adult footprints around, just that one lone mark. I kept walking, slower now. The daylight was fading and the forest was getting darker. A distant sound caught my attention. I stopped to listen better. It was a child's laughter. The sound came from the right, between the dense trees, a short, light laugh, but full of something wrong. My throat went dry. "Who's there?" I called, my voice small and out of place. No answer. The forest went silent again, but now it was a different silence, filled with expectation. I decided to keep going, convincing myself that the sound was just the wind blowing through the trees. After a few minutes, the trail led me to an old cabin. The wooden walls were rotten and leaning, and the roof was partially collapsed. The door hung on a rusty hinge. Apparently, this is one of the cabins used by lumberjacks in the 1950s. Let's take a look. I pushed open the door, which creaked loudly. The interior was covered in dust and dead leaves. Broken toys were scattered across the floor. A headless teddy bear, a rusty spinning top, a chipped building block. Who would leave these here? I bent down to examine the teddy bear. When I touched it, I felt something strange. It was damp and cold, as if someone had just left it there. A laugh sounded right behind me. I spun so fast I almost lost my balance. The door was open. The path outside was plunged into shadow. There was no one there, just still trees and the cold wind. My breathing was ragged. My initial confidence was starting to fade. I got up and left the cabin, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. The sky was now almost completely dark. As I turned back to the trail, something made me look down at the ground. More small footprints were there. They went forward, then back, as if someone was following me and stopping each time I stopped. I felt a cold presence behind me. I turned slowly. The trail was empty, but the silence of the forest seemed about to explode into terrible sounds. My breath was short and ragged. The silence of the forest was now a heavy, oppressive blanket. The small footprints on the trail seemed to follow me, moving forward and then back, as if an invisible child were playing with me. The chill of the night began to seep into my bones. "Okay, Jake. Breathe. They're just footprints. It could be anything." But my voice was shaking more than I would have liked. What I was saying didn't match what I was feeling. Something was wrong in this forest. I glanced at the camera strapped to my chest and forced a weak smile. "Guys, it looks like we have something interesting here. Fresh footprints, laughter. Let's follow it a little further and see where it takes us." My feet didn't want to move, but curiosity or maybe stubbornness, pushed me forward. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, creating long shadows that danced between the trees. Each step made the sound of dry leaves mix with a distant rustling, as if someone were walking with me, always out of sight. The trail seemed to stretch out longer than usual, as if the forest was rearranging itself to keep me inside. The feeling of being watched only grew. I looked back several times, but all I saw were shadows and twisted trees. Suddenly, the rustling stopped. The silence returned, thick and absolute. And then, a voice whispered very close to my ear, "Play with us." I spun so fast that I almost dropped the flashlight. The light danced through the trees, revealing only emptiness. My heart was beating so hard it hurt. A shiver ran down my spine, making every hair on my body stand on end. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound firm. The only answer was a childish laugh that echoed throughout the forest. This time, it wasn't a single laugh. It was several voices coming from all directions, a chorus of invisible children having fun at my expense. I took a step back and felt something move beneath my foot. I looked down. It was an old, dirty, damp teddy bear. It hadn't been there before, the same one I'd seen at the cabin. How had it gotten here? My stomach churned. "I need to get out of here." I turned and began walking quickly down the trail. Each step I took was followed by the sound of smaller footsteps running around me. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't resist. I turned my head quickly. For a split second, I saw a small silhouette among the trees. A child in a white dress, her hair falling over her face. She was still, but her eyes, two dark, empty smudges, were fixed on me. The flashlight trembled in my hand. I blinked, and the figure disappeared. "No, no, no. This isn't real," I whispered desperately. I started running. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. My lungs burned, but fear kept me going. The laughter grew louder, higher pitched, almost hysterical. The trees seemed to close in around me, forming a living prison. My foot tripped over a root and I hit the ground with a thud. The flashlight rolled away, casting light at odd angles. I tried to stand up, but a small cold hand grabbed my wrist. I looked down. A child was crouched beside me. Her skin was too pale, her lips purple. She smiled, but there was no joy on her face, only a desperate emptiness. "You came to play, didn't you?" she whispered. I screamed and yanked my arm free of her icy grip. I grabbed the flashlight and ran without looking back. My feet barely touched the ground. I didn't know if I was going in the right direction. I only knew that I had to get away. Suddenly, I saw a faint light ahead, a familiar glow, the beginning of the trail. I ran toward the exit with all my remaining strength. As I broke through the tree line, I fell to my knees on the cold, damp ground. The silence of the night was now comforting. I was out of the forest. I turned to look at the trail, just darkness. But then I saw a pair of glowing eyes looking at me through the trees, and a soft voice, almost a whisper, reached my ears. "Until next time." The Pine Ridge forest was quiet again, but I knew the echoes of the lost children were still there, waiting for the next visitor. My name is Bill Carson. I'm 45 years old. I've been a truck driver for almost 20 years, and I've seen it all on American roads. Terrible accidents, unexpected storms, creatures crossing the road in the middle of the night, but never anything that couldn't be explained. It was just work. Road, delivery, road again. No ghosts, no mysteries. Just miles of asphalt and the roar of the engine. That night I was on the legendary Route 66, cutting through the New Mexico desert. The sky was clear and full of stars, but the road was an endless carpet of black, illuminated only by the headlights of my truck. There were no other vehicles, no houses in sight, just a desolate expanse and the hot wind blowing sand against the bodywork. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 12:37 a.m. I was late for my delivery in Flagstaff, but that was okay. I'd driven this stretch many times before. I turned on the radio to chase away the oppressive silence. Country music played softly, accompanying the steady roar of the engine. Everything was normal. Then, out of nowhere, the music was cut off by a staticky sound. I frowned and turned the dial to adjust the frequency. The static grew louder until a soft voice emerged from the hiss. "Please, help me." The voice was female, weak and desperate. My stomach turned and a chill ran down my spine. I fumbled with the dial again, trying to tune to another station. "I'm stuck. Please help me." The voice came back clearer this time. I glanced at the radio, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. There was no radio signal on this part of Route 66. It was too deserted, far from any station. "It must be some interference," I muttered, trying to stay calm. "Maybe a pirate radio or a lost broadcast." But the voice continued. "Can you hear me? Please. I'm at the house with the rusty sign. He's coming." A picture formed in my mind. An old, abandoned house with a fallen, rusty sign. It was almost a cliché, but it made my skin crawl nonetheless. The road ahead of me seemed endless. The desert stretched out on both sides, empty and indifferent. Suddenly, something appeared at the side of the road. An old, dark structure, barely lit by my headlights. An abandoned house. I slowed down, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The voice's description was accurate. Broken windows, a roof caving in, a rusty sign lying on the ground. It can't be. My voice sounded hoarse. I had two options: keep going and forget about it, or stop and investigate. My logic screamed at me to keep going, but something in the voice, the urgency of it, made me slow down until the truck came to a complete stop. I turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and absolute, broken only by the wind whistling across the desert. I climbed out of the truck, the sand crunching beneath my boots. The house looked even more ominous up close. The front door was ajar, swinging gently on its rusty hinges. The smell of rotting wood and rust permeated the air. I glanced back at my truck. The lights were still on, a small anchor of normalcy in this sea of darkness. "It's just an old house, Bill. Nothing special." I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. It swung open with a long, ominous creak. The darkness inside was thick, almost solid. I turned on my flashlight and shone it inside. Furniture was covered in dust. Pieces of wallpaper were peeling, and cobwebs hung like curtains. In the center of the room, on a rotting wooden table, sat an old radio. One of those 1950s models with big knobs and a lighted dial. It was on, emitting a soft static. I approached slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The static changed, and the soft voice whispered again, "Please, he's coming." A biting cold filled the room. The air became heavy, hard to breathe. I felt a presence behind me, as if something was watching me from the shadows. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Only darkness and the sound of the wind outside. I looked back at the radio. The light on the display blinked. The voice was now closer, almost at my ear. "Run!" Before I could react, a loud crash echoed through the house. The door slammed shut, and the radio emitted a deafening hiss. I was no longer alone. The door slammed shut so hard that the sound reverberated through my chest like a gunshot. My heart raced, and the cold in the room intensified until it felt like bone-piercing ice. The radio continued to hiss, the dim light on the dial blinking like a warning signal. "Run!" the voice whispered again, this time clearer, closer, as if the person were right next to me. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Nothing but the twisted shadows of the walls and rotting furniture. "This is a hallucination, Bill. It has to be," I said to myself, trying to control my rising fear. But it wasn't a hallucination. The smell of rust, the intense cold, the heaviness of the atmosphere. It was all too real. I took a step back, the wood of the floor creaking under my weight. Then I heard another sound. Slow, shuffling footsteps in the dark hallway to my right. Every fiber of my body screamed to get out of there, but my legs were pinned in terror. The radio screeched louder, the desperate voice shouting, "He's here, get away!" A crash echoed through the hallway. Something heavy fell to the floor, followed by a deep, hoarse breath. I felt a shadowy presence approaching, each step making the floor vibrate slightly. A shadow began to form at the entrance to the hallway, tall and shapeless, with indistinct edges that seemed to blend into the darkness. Finally, my body reacted. I turned and ran toward the front door. My fingers slid over the cold, rusty doorknob. The door wouldn't open. It was as if an invisible force held it in place. I pulled with all my strength, cold sweat running down my face. The radio emitted a deafening hiss, and then the voice came back, louder and clearer than ever. "He won't let anyone out." A deadly chill ran down my spine. I turned slowly, my eyes widening at what I saw. The shadow was approaching the center of the room. It was a humanoid figure, but without any defined features. Its body seemed to be made of black smoke and burning oil, its contours moving as if it were alive. Two glowing eyes, red as glowing coals, fixed me. The figure let out a deep breath, which sounded like a distant growl. The entire room seemed to close in around me, the walls leaning toward me. "Please, run," the voice on the radio pleaded, now weak and distorted. With a cry of despair, I gave the door a violent kick. It burst open and I ran outside, the cold desert air burning my lungs. Behind me, the house seemed to expel a wave of darkness, as if the night itself were being vomited out through the door. I ran toward the truck, my boots slipping in the sand. I jumped into the cab and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I stepped on the gas and the truck surged forward, throwing sand and rocks behind it. In the rearview mirror, I saw the house moving away. The shadow stood in the doorway, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. The figure didn't move. It just watched as I fled. The truck's radio was still on, static hissing softly. Suddenly, the voice came back, barely a whisper now. "Thank you." The static faded, replaced by silence. My mind was racing. What had happened? Who was that voice? What was that shadow? I had no answers, but one thing was certain. I would never go back to that place again. After a few miles, I stopped the truck on the side of the road to catch my breath. The desert was calm again, as if nothing had happened. I looked at the radio. The frequency was 66.6 FM. I frowned. There was no such frequency. I turned off the radio and looked at the horizon. The road stretched out in front of me, inviting and empty. I took a deep breath and put the truck in drive. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Something that didn't belong in this world. And then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled again. The same voice whispered, this time more distant, "He's still coming." The frequency on the display flashed, 66.6 FM. I knew that this road would never be the same again. My name is Ryan Carter. I'm 34 years old and have been a detective for the past decade in Willow Creek, a sleepy little town in Michigan where little more than petty thefts and bar fights rarely happen. I've always been a skeptic. I believe in facts, evidence, and that every crime can be solved with logic and determination. At least that's what I believed until the Mirror Lake murders began. Now, here I am, standing on the edge of this silent lake, with a thick fog creeping over the surface like a veil of morning. It's 3 a.m. The sky is overcast, with not a single star visible, and the cold wind carries the damp smell of stagnant water. In front of me, the body of a young woman lies on the shore. Amanda Lewis, 23, missing for 2 days. Her eyes are open, frozen in an expression of pure terror, as if she had seen something unspeakable before she died. I take a deep breath, trying to dispel the feeling of unease growing in my chest. The scene makes no sense. There are no signs of a struggle, no footprints other than ours. The only thing out of the ordinary is a trail of water leading from the body to the edge of the lake, as if she had climbed out of it. What the hell happened here? I muttered to myself. My flashlight cuts through the darkness, illuminating the distorted reflection of the trees in the water. The surface is too calm, like a liquid mirror. A few forensics officers stand behind me, whispering nervously to each other. They don't like this place. And for the first time, I understand why. "Detective Carter?" Officer Harris's voice snaps me back to reality. We found this in her pocket. He hands me a wet piece of paper. I open it carefully, the writing smudged but still legible. He's in the water. A chill runs down my spine. I look back at the lake, feeling an invisible pressure tighten in my chest. He's in the water. Who is he? And why did Amanda write this before she died? This is starting to get out of hand, Harris says, his voice shaking. People are scared, Detective. They want answers. And they're going to get them, I say, trying to hide my own uncertainty. But what answers could I give? This was the fourth victim in less than 3 months, all of them found exactly the same way. Bodies on the shore of the lake, clothes soaked through, expressions frozen in terror. There were no footprints, no witnesses, just the lake, still and unresponsive. I walk closer to the water, my shoes sinking into the wet mud. A part of me hopes to see some clue, something logical that would explain all of this. But all I see is the flickering reflection of the trees and my own figure, distorted by the fog. Then something moves. A shadowy shadow glides beneath the surface of the water, too fast to be a fish. My heart races. I stand still, holding my breath, my eyes fixed on the lake. The water calms again, as if nothing had happened. Was it my imagination? Was it fatigue playing tricks on me? I take a step back, feeling the cold seep into my bones. An irrational fear begins to grow inside me like a poisoned seed. I try to push it away. I don't believe in monsters, ghosts, or curses. There are only criminals and the detectives who catch them. But Mirror Lake seems to laugh at my logic. Let's collect the body, I tell Harris, and keep the perimeters sealed. No one comes in here until we have more information. Harris nods, relieved to be able to get away from the lake. I watch as he joins the other officers, and for a moment, I'm alone. The wind blows softly, making the leaves on the trees whisper ancient secrets. The silence is so deep I can almost hear my own blood rushing through my veins. Suddenly, a low, distant voice cuts through the air, carried on the wind. A whispering voice, almost imperceptible, but real enough to make my heart stop for a second. You shouldn't be here. My eyes widen and I turn my head to all sides. There's no one there. Just the fog, the darkness, and the lake, still and serene. I take a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it's just the wind, or maybe I'm starting to lose my mind. That's it for today, I mutter, pushing away from the shore. As I walk back to the car, I feel an invisible presence watching me. The feeling is so intense that I don't dare look back. Something is in Mirror Lake, something that doesn't want to be discovered. And now I know that this investigation will be like no other I've faced before. Little did I know that this was only the beginning. That voice still echoed in my mind. You shouldn't be here. I could try to ignore it, but I couldn't forget. I spent the night awake, sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the reports of the 4 victims. The images of the bodies with their terrified expressions haunted me, and Amanda Lewis's wet paper sat there beside me, like a silent reminder of what I couldn't explain. The lake was challenging me, and for the first time I felt like I might be dealing with something beyond my comprehension. But I couldn't stop. It was my job, or maybe my obsession, to figure this out. I had to go back to the lake and find some clue that could fit these pieces together. The next morning, I put on my heavy coat and headed back to Mirror Lake. The fog from the night before had lifted, but the cold lingered. The trees were too still, their bare branches like skeletal fingers pointing up at the cloudy sky. The water remained still, reflecting the world in a way that felt wrong, as if something was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for me. I took a deep breath and began walking along the shore. Each step sank into the cold mud, leaving tracks that were quickly erased by the dampness. The silence was so profound that my own thoughts seemed too loud. Then I heard it. Plop. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like something breaking the surface of the water. I turned my head quickly, my hand instinctively going to the gun in my holster. There was nothing, just the mirror-like surface of the lake, unchanged. I'm getting paranoid, I thought. I kept walking, my eyes scanning every inch of the shore. It was then that I saw something among the reeds, a dark shape, half submerged. I approached cautiously, my muscles tensing. The muddy water slowly revealed what was hidden, a silver earring stuck in a water plant. A sharp chill ran down my spine. It was the same kind of earring Amanda Lewis wore. How did this get here? "I'm sorry," I muttered, bending down to pick up the object. The water around the earring had darkened, as if black ink had been spilled there. When my hand touched the surface, a wave of ice-cold water rushed up my arm. The pain was so intense that I let out a cry and recoiled, falling backward into the mud. My wrist burned, as if it had been plunged into pure ice. Before I could stand up, I saw the water churn. Bubbles began to rise, popping softly on the surface. Then the figure emerged. A human silhouette, translucent and dark, began to slowly rise from the water. Its face was a blur, but its eyes, two cold, pale lights, were fixed on me. My breath caught in my throat and my entire body went numb with terror. The figure took a step toward me. Every movement it made was accompanied by a splashing sound, as if it were completely soaked. It raised a skeletal hand and pointed at me. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was a cold whisper, like wind rustling through graves. My mind screamed at me to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. Then the figure began to fade, dissolving into a cloud of black mist that merged back into the water. Silence returned, but the cold lingered. I managed to stand up, my knees shaking and my head throbbing. The icy mark still burned into my wrist, a physical reminder that it hadn't been a delusion. I took a deep breath, trying to process what I had just seen. "What are you?" I whispered to the lake, as if it could answer me. The lake, of course, fell silent, but I knew the truth now. Something ancient and angry inhabited these waters, something that could not be captured or trapped. And as long as that presence was there, no one would be safe. I walked back to the car, feeling defeated. My skeptical mind struggled with what my eyes had seen, but there was no longer any room for doubt. Willow Creek held a dark secret, and Mirror Lake was its silent and deadly guardian. When I arrived in town, the first rays of sunlight were beginning to tint the buildings with shades of gold. The world seemed to go on as usual, oblivious to the darkness I had encountered. But I knew that peace was only an illusion. The lake was waiting, and it wouldn't be long before another victim was lured into its depths. I looked at my reflection in the car mirror. My eyes were sunken, tired, with the shadow of a fear that would not go away. Some things cannot be stopped. They just wait. And as much as I tried to fight it, I knew that the lake was not finished with me. My name is Derek Miller. I'm 35 years old, an investigative journalist, and to be honest, I don't believe in ghost stories, aliens, or anything that defies logic. I've spent years debunking hoaxes and solving mysteries that turned out to be just stories badly told. When I heard about the disappearances on Nevada's Route 375, the infamous Alien Highway, I knew that was my next mission. To prove that it was all just paranoia and coincidence. Now here I am, driving alone on a highway in the middle of the desert. It's 11:50 p.m. The sky is a moonless black dome, dotted with stars that seem colder than bright. My headlights illuminate the cracked asphalt and the sand that the wind insists on blowing onto the road. All around me, the vastness of the desert stretches out in every direction, dotted only with jagged rock formations. The silence is almost absolute, interrupted only by the hum of the tires against the asphalt. I've been on the road for 2 hours now, and I haven't seen a single living soul. Not a house, not a light, nothing. Just emptiness. "Come on, Derek," I mutter to myself. "It's just another deserted road, nothing special." I look at the dashboard. The clock reads 001. A strange feeling begins to settle in the back of my mind, an uneasiness that I can't explain. I take a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Suddenly, the radio hisses, an abrupt interference that makes me jump in my seat. The sound is a low hiss, interrupted by static and whispers. I turn the radio knob to turn it off, but the hissing persists. The volume increases on its own, and for a moment I swear I hear my name among the noises. Derek, are you listening? My skin crawls. I glance in the rearview mirror, but the road behind me is empty, lit only by the car's taillights. I try to calm myself. It must just be a glitch in the radio. Cheap technology never lasts long in this desert heat. The interference disappears as quickly as it started. The silence returns, but now it feels thicker, as if something invisible is surrounding me. I keep driving, forcing myself to focus on the road. Then I see it, lights appearing on the horizon. Small at first, then larger and brighter. They flicker and move erratically, too fast to be another car's headlights. My fingers sweat on the steering wheel. The lights seem to be following me, keeping up with my car's speed. I accelerate a little, trying to outrun them, but the lights adjust, floating and dancing in the night sky. For a moment, they disappear. It was just your imagination, Derek, I whisper, my voice shaking. But before I can finish the sentence, the lights reappear, this time right next to the car. They're so close I can see their glow reflected in the windows. A low hum fills the air, making the steering wheel vibrate in my hands. No, 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 I whisper. I accelerate even more, the engine roaring in protest. Eyes glued to the road, I ignore everything around me, focused only on moving forward. But the road seems to stretch on forever, as if I'm stuck in an endless loop. The lights keep following me, zigzagging alongside me like predators toying with their prey. My heart beats so fast it feels like it's going to come out of my mouth. I try to convince myself that there's a rational explanation for all of this. Weather balloons, drones, some elaborate prank. Then the radio crackles again. A metallic, distorted voice emerges from the static. Stop now, before it's too late. My mind freezes. The hum grows louder, filling every corner of the car. The lights are now in front of me, blocking the road. There's nowhere to go. My instincts scream at me to brake, but my fear makes me accelerate even more. The lights shine brightly, blinding me for a second. I feel an all-encompassing glare, as if the world itself is shattering around me. And then, silence. When I open my eyes, I'm stopped on the shoulder of the road. The engine is off and the clock on the dashboard reads 0001, exactly the same time as before. I look around, but the road is empty. The lights are gone. The radio is muted. My hands are shaking. My entire body is covered in cold sweat. I try to process what just happened, but my mind refuses to cooperate. I was there. The lights were there. But now, all that's left is darkness. What the hell is going on here? I whisper. The road ahead of me seems to stretch on forever, a strip of asphalt leading into the unknown. I take a deep breath and start the car, determined to keep going. I need answers, even if the truth is waiting to swallow me. The car engine roared to life with a low roar, but nothing seemed normal. The clock still read 0001. It was as if time had stopped. I looked out the window and the road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, shrouded in oppressive darkness. I took a deep breath and accelerated. With every mile I drove, the fear grew, a tight knot in my stomach. The silence was almost deafening. Only the sound of the tires on the cracked asphalt reminded me that I was still there. But something was wrong. Every shadow seemed to move. Every breath of wind whispered my name. Then the radio crackled again. The static intensified, twisting into distorted sounds. A metallic voice emerged from the noise. Stop now, before it's too late. My heart raced. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to ignore the shiver running down my spine. The voice seemed to be inside my head, pulsing with every beat of my heart. In the rearview mirror, I saw lights glowing on the horizon, small at first, but quickly growing. They moved too fast with unnatural precision, first behind me, then beside me, as if they were escorting me. I accelerated even more, the engine roaring in protest. Come on, this can't be real, I muttered to myself. The lights surrounded me, pulsing with an almost painful intensity. I tried to look away, but they were everywhere. A low hum filled the air, making the steering wheel vibrate beneath my hands. My ears ached, my head throbbed. Then suddenly the lights went out. Darkness returned, thick and suffocating. It took my eyes a few seconds to adjust. It was as if the road had disappeared, replaced by a black void. I looked around, trying to make sense of where I was. The rock formations were different, distorted, like the twisted silhouettes of creatures lurking in the darkness. The cold was biting, and the silence was absolute. That was when I saw it. A figure was standing on the side of the road, tall, slender, shrouded in shadows. Its eyes were 2 points of cold, lifeless light. My lungs tightened, and fear paralyzed me. The figure raised an arm and pointed at me. "You shouldn't be here," whispered the metallic voice. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure took a step forward, and the ground seemed to shake beneath its feet. A feeling of absolute emptiness enveloped me, as if the world were disintegrating around me. With a superhuman effort, I pressed down on the accelerator pedal. The tires skidded on the loose sand and the car moved forward. The figure disappeared into the darkness, but the cold remained, clinging to my bones. The road materialized again in front of me. The lights had disappeared. The humming had stopped. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing but darkness. I drove on and on until I saw the first rays of sunlight tinting the sky orange and pink. When I finally stopped the car, I was back where I had started my journey. The clock read 6:30. The lost time was a blank in my memory, like a chapter torn from a book. I got out of the car, my legs shaking. The desert around me seemed calm and normal, but I knew better. Something ancient and intelligent lurked on that road, waiting for fools like me to play cat and mouse. I took one last look at Route 375. It looked like an ordinary road, but I knew the truth. Some mysteries are not meant to be investigated. Some roads are not meant to be traveled. I started the car and drove away without looking back. My name is Chris Matthews. I'm a 22-year-old journalism student at the University of Chicago, and I've always been fascinated by unsolved crime stories. It's not just the gruesome details or the fear they evoke. It's the idea that the truth is out there, buried beneath layers of time and silence, waiting to be unearthed. In recent weeks, Chicago has been in a panic over a series of brutal murders. 4 victims, all found in abandoned butcher shops, horribly mutilated. The similarity to the crimes committed in the 1920s by John the Cleaver Reynolds is impossible to ignore. After his execution in 1926, the murders stopped. So how do you explain that nearly a century later the same horrors are happening again? Tonight I decided to go to one of those abandoned butcher shops. I needed to see it for myself, to feel the weight of this dark history. The place I chose was the old Reed's Butcher Shop, closed since the 1950s. It was located in a dimly lit alley, surrounded by decaying buildings and an unsettling silence. I pushed the rusty door open with a long creak, as if the building itself were protesting my presence. The smell of rust and rotting meat filled my nostrils, making my stomach churn. The flashlight in my hand shook slightly as I shone it into the dark interior. The floor was covered in dust and debris. Countertops stained with dried blood and rusty blades still hung on the walls, as if the place had been abandoned in a hurry. Each step I took produced a muffled creak. The silence seemed to absorb the sound, making each movement heavier. "Just a dusty old butcher shop, Chris," I muttered to myself, trying to ease the weight of my growing fear. As I explored, the beam of the flashlight illuminated strange markings on the walls, deep scratches, as if someone had scraped a razor blade against the tile. I crouched down to take a picture and realized the marks formed words. "He's never gone." My heart raced. I straightened up quickly, my eyes scanning the room. Nothing moved, but a sense of being watched intensified. The air grew colder, sharp as an invisible blade. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound coming from the back of the store, something being dragged across the floor. I froze in place, my blood running cold in my veins. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I tried to focus on the source of the sound. "Is anyone there?" My voice came out shaky, barely audible. The silence answered, thick and oppressive. I took a hesitant step toward the sound. My feet sank slightly into something damp. I looked down and saw a trail of fresh blood stretching all the way to the back door. A wave of nausea hit me, but my curiosity got the better of me. I followed the trail, each step taking me deeper into the nightmare. The back door was ajar, pitch black beyond it. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The flashlight illuminated a small room. Rusty hooks hung from the ceiling, and a figure covered in a bloody sheet hung from one of them. My mind took a moment to process what I was seeing. Then the sheet moved. I let out a muffled scream and took a step back, the flashlight nearly falling from my hand. The sheet fell to the floor, revealing only a grotesquely mutilated mannequin. But there was something even worse. A cracked mirror in the background reflected the room, and a tall, hooded shadow behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. "Enough of this," I muttered, my heart beating so fast it felt like it would explode. I ran out of the butcher shop, the sounds of my footsteps echoing like hammer blows in my brain. When I reached the street, the cold night air hit me like a punch. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I looked back. The door to the butcher shop was closed, as if it had never been opened, but I knew what I had seen. I knew I was not alone inside. John, the Cleaver Reynolds, may have been dead for almost a century, but something told me he was never really gone. And now he wanted everyone to know it. I just didn't know if I was willing to find out what he wanted. The cold night wind bit my face as I walked away from the butcher shop. My lungs burned, and my heart was still pounding wildly. The street was deserted, lit only by dim streetlights that cast distorted shadows. My hands were shaking, and I could still smell the rust and rotting flesh clinging to me. I tried to rationalize what had happened. A trick of the mind? A suggestion? Maybe I was too tired, and my imagination, fueled by all the stories of John the Cleaver Reynolds, had played a trick on me. But I knew the truth. That cracked mirror had reflected something real. A tall, hooded shadow that shouldn't have been there. I went back to my apartment downtown. I locked the door several times and threw myself on the bed without taking off my shoes. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark butcher shop, the bloody sheet falling, and that shadow waiting behind me. I woke up with the morning sun beating down on my face. A feeling of exhaustion washed over me, as if I hadn't slept a minute. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a message from Sarah Monroe, the police detective who occasionally read my articles. "We need to talk. Another body has been found. Same pattern, same location. You're getting into something dangerous." My stomach knotted. Another murder. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my camera and a notepad and headed out to the crime scene. The butcher shop was only 5 blocks from the first one I'd visited. Police cruisers flashed and yellow tape blocked the entrance. Sarah stood by the door, her face pale and her eyes tired. "You shouldn't be here, Chris," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "This isn't a story for the college paper. It's real." "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to understand this." Sarah sighed and let me pass. I walked into the butcher shop with a chill down my spine. The familiar smell of blood and rust hit me like a punch to the gut. This time it wasn't a mannequin. It was a real body. A woman, maybe in her 30s, hanging from a meat hook, just like Reynolds' victims in the 1920s. Her hands were cold, her eyes wide with frozen terror. Suddenly, I felt a presence. A wave of cold washed over the room. I turned slowly, and there he was. A tall figure dressed in an old butcher's apron stained with dried blood. His face was covered in deep shadow, but his eyes glowed with a sickly light. In his hands was a large knife, the blade sharp and gleaming. "You shouldn't be here." The guttural voice seemed to come from every direction at once. My throat went dry. My feet were glued to the floor, paralyzed by terror. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved slowly toward me, the knife glinting in the dim light. "He never left," I whispered. remembering the words scratched into the wall. Suddenly the figure disappeared, like smoke blown away by the wind. The room went silent again, but the fear remained. The victim's body was still there, but there was no sign of the killer. Sarah rushed in, gun drawn. "Chris, are you okay? What happened?" "He was here," my voice came out as a whisper. "Reynolds, or something that looks like him. He never left." Sarah looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and fear. She wanted to doubt it, but her eyes said she believed it, at least partly. "We need to get out of here," she said, tugging at my arm. Outside, the cool air made me shiver. The sky was gray, as if reflecting the heaviness of that morning. "What are you going to do now?" Sarah asked. "Right," I said. "People need to know that this isn't over, that it might never be over." She nodded. "Be careful, Chris. Some stories are too dangerous to tell." As I walked home, I felt the weight of that truth. John the Cleaver Reynolds was still out there, in one form or another. Maybe a vengeful spirit, maybe something worse. And I knew he wasn't done. The streets of Chicago had never felt so dark. My name is Michael Hayes. I'm 38 years old and have been a detective in Philadelphia for over a decade. I've seen the worst of humanity: homicides, disappearances, unexplained crimes. I've always believed that the real evil lies in the living, not the dead. Ghosts, demons, bullshit. Until I stepped foot in Ravenwood Asylum. It was late at night when I arrived at the old mental hospital. Ravenwood had been closed in the 1950s after a series of unexplained disappearances. Now, children were vanishing from the surrounding area. 4 disappearances in less than 2 months. The clues had led me to this place. The building's facade was a monstrosity of dark brick and broken windows. The full moon cast crooked shadows on the walls, making the outlines look like deformed faces. I took a deep breath, adjusted the flashlight in my hand, and pushed open the rotting wooden double doors. They gave way with a creak that echoed like a muffled scream. The smell of mold and rust filled my nostrils. Peeling walls, overturned furniture, yellowed scraps of paper scattered across the floor. Ravenwood was a monument to abandonment and despair. The dim light of the flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. "Just another old building, Michael," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the discomfort. I took a few steps, my shoes sinking into the accumulated dust. My eyes scanned the room, searching for something. Anything. A clue. A trail. But all I found were empty hallways and the echoes of my own footsteps. And then I heard it. A childish laugh, soft and distant, that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I gripped the flashlight tighter and followed the sound. My boots squeaked on the rotten floorboards, each step accompanied by the cold that grew around me. I turned the corner and stopped in front of a door marked Treatment Room 3. The ink was faded, but the letters still seemed to whisper ancient secrets. I put my hand on the doorknob and felt the cold metal against my skin. The door opened with a long, painful creak. The room was plunged into darkness. I shone the light inside and saw a rusty gurney in the center, leather straps hanging from it, ready to hold some forgotten patient. Dust-covered medical instruments were scattered on metal trays. A noise behind me, a barely audible whisper. I turned quickly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Nothing, just the empty, dark hallway. I swallowed hard and looked back into the room. A sheet of paper lay on the gurney, yellowed with age. I walked over and picked it up carefully. It was a medical report from 1952. The words were blurred, but I could make out one sentence. Treatment failed. He has disappeared. The room must be sealed. What the hell? I muttered, feeling cold sweat trickle down the back of my neck. Before I could finish my thought, I heard the laughter again. This time it was closer, almost right next to me. I turned the flashlight toward the sound and saw a shadow run down the hallway. "Hey, who's there?" I shouted, running after it. My footsteps echoed loudly and the hallway seemed to stretch out in front of me. I turned another corner and found a half-open door. Without thinking, I pushed it open and went in. It was a playroom, or what was left of it. Broken porcelain dolls, mutilated teddy bears, and children's drawings scattered across the floor. One drawing caught my eye, a tall, dark figure with long arms and empty eyes. My breath caught in my throat. Behind me, the door slammed shut. The flashlight's light flickered and went out for a second. In the brief moment of darkness, I felt an icy presence. When the light came back on, I saw a silhouette in the corner of the room, tall, hooded, with eyes that glowed like two unlit embers. My muscles froze. The figure didn't move, but the room seemed to shrink around it. A whisper filled the air. "You shouldn't be here." A cold wind blew, extinguishing the light from the lantern. Darkness filled the room. Fear gripped my chest like an invisible hand. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then the light came back on. The figure was gone. Panting, I ran out of the room, my heart pounding. When I finally reached the front door of the asylum, I pushed it open and felt the cold night air envelop me. I stepped out onto the deserted street, trying to process what had just happened. Ravenwood had secrets that didn't want to be discovered, and now I knew I was dealing with something much worse than I had expected. The doors of Ravenwood Asylum closed behind me with a sharp thud, but the oppressive chill still clung to my skin. The night air didn't bring me the relief I'd hoped for. Every shadow on the street seemed to have eyes. Every sigh of the wind seemed to contain a whisper. I climbed into my car and slammed the door, trying to control the shaking in my hands. The steering wheel was ice cold and my joints ached from clenching so hard. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. No signal. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. I needed to leave this place behind. But something wouldn't let me. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, but my instincts told me it wasn't over. Something inside needed to be discovered. It needed to be freed or stopped. I tried to convince myself that I was tired, that I needed to rest and come back in the morning. But I knew I had no choice. If I left now, I probably wouldn't have the courage to come back. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. And then I opened the door and headed back to the asylum. The beams of the flashlight cut through the heavy darkness of the main hall. Corridors stretched like open wounds full of the promise of madness. The walls seemed to breathe. The floor creaked beneath my feet as if protesting my presence. "You can do it, Michael," I whispered to myself. "Just a little longer." I walked down the hallway toward the children's ward. This was the place that disturbed me the most. Voices of missing children had been reported by residents. This was where I would find answers, or doom. The door to the ward was slightly open, swinging in the wind that didn't exist. I pushed it open, and the creak echoed through the hallways like a lament. Inside, the walls were covered in drawings, figures with empty eyes, dead-end doors, and hands trying to escape from invisible bars. Then I heard the childish laughter again, soft but close. My heart pounded as I walked to the back of the room. A rusty gurney sat in the center, surrounded by broken toys. On the floor, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A new doll, too clean to have been there for decades. Its glass eyes seemed to follow me. I bent down to pick it up, but before I could touch it, I felt a blast of cold air on the back of my neck. "Please help me." The voice was weak, full of pain. I turned so quickly I almost fell. My flashlight illuminated the void, but for a second, I saw a figure, a small girl, dark hair covering her face, wearing a hospital gown. She looked at me through her hair and then disappeared like smoke. My throat was dry. Every rational part of my brain screamed that it was impossible, but I could no longer deny what I was seeing. Something was trapped here. Something needed my help. I stood up and headed toward the records room, my last hope of understanding what was happening. The door was locked, but a shoulder-pounding blow gave way. Dusty files were scattered everywhere. I rummaged through the drawers, tossing aside old papers. Finally, I found a folder marked with one word: Project Silence. The pages were yellowed and brittle. I read the contents with shaking hands. Experiments on children considered troubled. attempts to silence their minds through lobotomies and extreme isolation. Some children did not survive. Others disappeared. Those responsible were never found. A shiver ran down my spine. They were here. They were still here. "You shouldn't be here," a cold, hoarse voice whispered. I looked up. A hooded figure stood in the doorway of the room. Tall, arms too long, eyes glowing like ice wells. The flashlight's light flickered and failed. Darkness took over. My body wouldn't obey. The figure slowly approached, the air growing colder by the minute. When I finally managed to move, I ran for the door, my heart pounding. I tripped over scattered files, but managed to escape into the hallway. Behind me, I heard heavy, uneven footsteps. He was following me. My lungs burned as I ran through the hallways. Each door seemed to slam shut on its own, blocking my exit. I saw the entrance to the asylum ahead and gave one last push, throwing myself out. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I rolled on the cold floor outside, panting, my eyes fixed on the building. The windows were dark. The silence of the night returned. I stood up, feeling the weight of horror on my shoulders. The asylum fell silent, as if nothing had happened, but I knew the truth. The secrets of Ravenwood Asylum were alive. The voices of the past still echoed through those halls, and the shadowy figure I had encountered would not stop. Something had been awakened, and I knew it would not rest. Neither would I.